When two broken souls come together, the bond between them can be profoundly intense.
They were high school sweethearts.
She didn't grow up with a father figure in her life, so she has always looked for a man to fill that void.
He was book smart and street smart, and she just idolized him.
Transforming the lovers into an army of two, facing off against the world.
They used to fight. When I say fight, I mean fight.
She's blaming everyone, and she was responding to everyone, saying, "You don't know what really happened." She was going to be a ride or die for him.
But in the maze of toxic love, ill-fated choices weave a path to destruction.
You in a dark building with gunshots ringing.
I've seen people screaming, getting trampled over, people stopping, picking people up.
And in the aftermath, innocent lives are irreparably shattered.
He had a gunshot wound to his leg and a gunshot wound to his chest.
It was just chaos, just everywhere.
May 4th, 2017. It's just after midnight in downtown Jonesboro, Arkansas.
The city of Jonesboro is a good community. It has great schools, good people.
Everybody know everybody pretty much.
Downtown Jonesboro is very old. You do have our Forum, which has like productions for like the ballet or musicals.
It's a lot you can do here to build if that's what you want to do, but you just have to apply yourself to do it.
Around 12:23 a.m., Jonesboro police receive an urgent call for help.
This call comes in to the police, and it's an active shooting that has taken place.
The caller says the ongoing incident is at 311 South Main Street, a local venue called The Basement.
The basement was just a place where they throw parties.
A police officer was down the street working at another club, and he was one of the first responders that got there.
As the officer approaches, he witnesses a human stampede at the club's entrance.
It was very, very chaotic because you're having people stepping on other people to get out, but you had a whole bunch of people trying to get out all at once.
The police went down into the basement. They found Monterio Barnes, who was a 19-year-old individual, young man, and he had a gunshot wound to his leg and a gunshot wound to his chest.
All of his friends were trying to flip him over. They was tugging on him, and the police was pushing him off of him, like, move, everybody move.
He told the police that he couldn't breathe, and they attempted to assist him.
There is an officer that stays with him trying to render aid, but it is too late.
Monterio Barnes died at the scene.
From the moment Monterio Monty Barnes was born in Blytheville, Arkansas, he was a force to be reckoned with.
He started walking too soon for me. He learned to talk very well and hold good conversations. Monterio gravitated toward older people.
We used to always say he'd been here before. He was like a little old man, like he a pandemic child before the pandemic.
A spike in local crime prompted his family to move.
We decided Jonesboro because I was raising a son.
They came here to bring their kids here, to go to the schools.
While growing up in Jonesboro, Monterio adopted his family's old-school values.
I tried to teach them things as far as respect.
Just wanted him to grow up and to learn that life will give you what you put into it.
Monty's strongest bond was with his sister, who he considered his best friend.
Most siblings, like your mom tells you to take your brother with you, and you know, they would grumble about that. She didn't. She liked having Monterio around.
Yeah, that was my boy, my right-hand man. Monterio Barnes was the light of the room. He loved his family, he loved his friends.
Despite his youth, Monterio embraced the present and kept his focus on future opportunities.
He was just so curious about a lot of things in life. He wasn't really afraid to do a lot of things.
No one would have guessed that future would become out of reach forever. Monterio Barnes is the first casualty Jonesboro, Arkansas police encounter at the Basement nightclub.
The police are trying to figure out if they can find the shooter, for one, and clear the establishment before they can start doing the rendering aid of all those that had been shot.
Everybody stepping over each other. People getting walked on, stepped on.
You're having to triage, basically, when it comes to rendering aid, who needs help more, those that have gotten stepped on or those who had gotten shot.
You can't see nothing. You in a dark building with gunshots ringing.
Unraveling the mystery of who killed Monterio Barnes and why will push police and the community they serve to the limit. A shooting in a Jonesboro, Arkansas club left chaos in its wake and 19-year-old Monterio Barnes dead.
He choked on his blood on his back. That's how he passed.
First responders are now trying to make sense of the frantic scene.
They were trying to make sure that, for one, that the shooter is gone, that they aren't going to get shot.
I don't think they had enough police officers there quick enough to work the number of victims that they had. But that soon changed.
With so many people, like panic attacks, it was people that was having seizures, it was people that couldn't breathe, everybody on the phone with their mama. They trying to tell their mama where they at, what happened. It was chaotic. I never seen nothing like it in my life.
Monterio Barnes lost his life and 6 other people were shot.
You had Asia Smith, Carrie Bell, Cordarius Jackson, Devontae Fowler, Stephen Hawthorne, and Stephen Brimlett.
At the same time, responding officers interview partygoers to piece together what happened.
You have multiple officers arriving and they're getting statements from others because it's very important that we get the witnesses.
The few witnesses who remain on scene aren't interested in sharing.
You are having police starting to do interviews with people, but they are finding that it is harder than they thought because a lot of people are not wanting to talk.
I think they were afraid of what could happen to them if they talked to the police.
As they speak to bystanders, officers try to determine the exact details of the event hosted at the basement.
There was supposed to be a party and an event that was taking place by the CM Boys, Cash Money, and they were hosting just for local artists.
This was like an annual thing that they had.
They were charging an admission, and they had a number of local rappers there who were coming in to just, entertain, and folks were just showing up to listen to the music.
Detectives arrive on the scene and begin collecting evidence.
When investigators arrived to the scene, they found bullet holes, blood, cartridges, indicating that this was a chaotic and terrible scene.
Someone who was completely disregarding any human life that was in that room. He just seemed to be shooting, didn't seem to be aiming at one particular person.
Forensic evidence also reveals an important clue.
There were 2 guns being fired in the basement, but the question was, who had the guns?
Witnesses remain tight-lipped.
As many people as there were in that establishment, we did not have a lot of people that wanted to talk.
I think it was a combination of things, just general distrust in the police and also just a general fear that was extremely frustrating and difficult, made the investigation very difficult.
In a situation like the basement shooting, law enforcement knows that there's one group of witnesses that may be convinced to cooperate.
A detective speaks to shooting victim Cordarius Jackson at their bedside.
When police interviewed one of the victims, he emphatically insisted that he only saw one of the two shooters. And when they speak to other victims, they say the same name.
These kids are saying, it's KK. It's KK. KK shooting.
Armed with the name of a possible suspect, police are determined to track KK down and bring him in for questioning. Jonesboro detectives investigating the fatal shooting that claimed the life of 19-year-old Montario Barnes and seriously injured 6 others have identified a potential suspect known as KK.
After speaking with victims at the scene, they're hearing the same name, KK.
Investigators recognize KK as 20-year-old Calius Lane.
Calius Lane was no stranger to police. He had prior arrests for battery, driving under the influence, criminal trespassing, theft, drug possession, and parole violations.
And KK is also known to be associated with a local group involved in illegal activities.
Calius Lane, Chauncey Thomas, Deja Giles. So it's what we would call a group, but they did participate in criminal activity.
For example, they were robbing drug dealers. I mean, the perfect person to rob, because that person doesn't want to get involved with the police. But a number of times, these individuals were winding up shot or deceased.
Police are questioning if the melee at the basement is tied to organized criminal activity, but witnesses remain silent about any affiliations, except for one.
The one thing everyone interviewed agreed on was that Montario Barnes had no drug connections.
As word spread about Montario's death, tributes from friends poured in, while various accounts of the incident circulated online.
There was a lot of chatter about the basement on social media, particularly Facebook.
You know, making posts about this, making a post about that, because my daughter and my son, they were very well known.
Montario's friends was posting and commenting on what went on that night, but they weren't the only ones.
Detectives monitoring social media for leads noticed one vocal individual from the group closely tied to the suspects, Deja Giles.
There are Facebook messages that are made about the shooting, and Deja is also making comments back to people on Facebook. So there is a conversation that is going on, and Calius's name is getting pulled up.
Then Deja posed, "Oh yeah, I brought a gun in through my crop top, under my crop top."
That post stood out to police right away and put Deja on their radar. And in fact, it gave them another lead.
They actually told on themselves because they couldn't stay off social media.
At the same time, an incriminating video of Deja begins to circulate online.
There was a post that was made by a mutual friend and happened to catch Deja dancing with the firearm. She does take it down, but of course it's on Snapchat and somebody screenshotted it and it was still out there.
Then, another video reaches the police through an anonymous tip, directly linking the shooting to their suspect, Calius Lane.
There were people just videoing themselves or videoing who's all in the establishment, and it happened to catch the actual shooting. And as it's slowed down, you can clearly see that it is Calius Lane that did shoot.
The detectives took the video and slowed it down to get still shots from the video. From there, they see Calius Lane wearing white pants and no shirt, firing a handgun.
He was completely disregarding any human life that was in that room. He just seemed to be shooting, didn't seem to be aiming at one particular person.
It is a nightclub, and I will say it was dark, but when you're having also strobe lights and white pants, you're going to be recognized.
Armed with the video evidence, police move to arrest Calius Lane and Deja Giles, but they are nowhere to be found.
Police released their names to the public and offer an award for any information about their whereabouts. instructing people to call the Jonesboro police or Crime Stoppers.
It was more difficult to find KK and Deja because they had fled the state of Arkansas.
Detectives turned their attention to other associates captured in the video.
We identified the individuals who were in that video, and we began to confront people one at a time.
Investigators tracked down a known associate of the suspects, Chauncey "Jigga" Thomas, and his girlfriend, Natalie Johnson, and bring them in for questioning, placing them in adjacent interview rooms.
The initial picture that was painted of this shooting was that both KK and Jigga, which is Chauncey Thomas, were involved. We know that there were 2 guns being fired in the basement. So there was a lot of evidence and a lot of unanswered questions about who was shooting other than KK.
She's saying to the police, you already know because you have video of it. I'm trying to clear my baby daddy. He didn't do anything, but without trying to say it was Kalius. No one in the inner circle actually want to say that it is Kalius.
Detectives focus on Chauncey, but after 5 hours of questioning, they come up empty.
Chauncey has kind of been this entire time, I don't really know what's going on. He does not want to assist in helping his best friend basically get in trouble.
Officers decide to confront Chauncey with the video of the shooting.
He could not, at that point, basically dispute anything. There's nothing that anyone could dispute when it was on camera that he was shooting.
Chauncey Thomas is looking at a murder rap of his own if he does not cooperate with the police. So he finally begins to tell the truth about that night and his role with KK.
As they dive deeper, they learn that Kalius and Deja are more deeply connected than people realized.
She bought the gun, she helped him flee, and she's deeply entangled with the whole thing. They were in a relationship.
Jonesboro, Arkansas detectives have video evidence showing Kalius Lane firing into a packed dance floor, killing 19-year-old Monterio Barnes. But before they can be arrested, Kalius and his girlfriend, Deja Giles, have vanished.
From the law enforcement perspective, it looks like they are fleeing the jurisdiction.
Since the authorities were unable to bring Deja and Kalius in, they turned their attention to Chauncey Thomas, who was also caught on video during the shooting, to press for more information that would also help them apprehend the couple.
So during this whole time, we're just watching the news and trying to see if they're going to get this person or what.
Police closely monitor Deja's social media accounts in the hopes she reveals the couple's whereabouts.
Deja's socials does not show where they are, but they do show that she's doing damage control and scrubbing anything that may implicate her man in the killing.
So she's just trying to figure out who has the video and trying to defend Kalius, and at the same time, they're on their way to Texas.
It turns out Deja's been running her whole life. Deja Giles was born into a single-family home where the streets seemed more attractive than the home.
Deja's father was in and out of prison.
Deja been out on her own since she was maybe 15, 16.
Deja didn't grow up with a father figure in her life, and so she has always looked for a man to fill that void, and she found that with Kalius.
Actually, Kalius is very smart. Like, he had the highest score on his SAT for his graduating year. He was smart, but he was street, too.
As their relationship deepened, so did Kalius's need for control.
The control seems to start small and mentally. He may want you to dress a certain way, then speak a certain way, Since he's the dominant one, he'll want you to be submissive without arguing. And the control goes from mental to physical.
Not that Deja didn't push back. She's been through enough to know she needed to assert herself any chance she got. They used to fight. When I say fight, I mean fight.
But after Deja gave birth to their son, that all changed.
Deja was known for fighting, but after she had her kids, she let all of that go.
Kaylee has also had another baby mom and another child.
I don't think they ever broke up during this entire time, that they were together.
I think that when she had her child, she finally had a family that she could call her own that would not ever leave her. I think that she's created sort of a narrative in her head that, we can be this, picture perfect family.
Police know it's only a matter of time before Deja and Kalius resurface. Meanwhile, as they re-interview witnesses and Chauncey Thomas, a clearer picture of the night's events begins to emerge.
You are having some eyewitnesses that were just because they know that Monterio didn't deserve to die and they were going to tell the truth.
There was more questions the detectives had or the prosecutor had, as far as the case was concerned.
The number one thing for me was, where did the gun come from?
The detectives know that Deja admitted on Facebook that she hid the gun in her crop top. What they want to find out is how did she get the gun in the venue that had a no weapons policy.
They were intentionally screening folks at the door for weapons.
The security there were just checking some of the kids that were coming in.
I don't think they were patting down the ladies.
After speaking to the witness, police discover that there was another gap in security.
So there was a gentleman in a wheelchair that had to go to the back entrance.
It was an old building, didn't have any real handicap access, and he came in without going through security.
On his wheelchair, he had a backpack that other partygoers said that he had, that they believed to have had firearms in that backpack.
Now, with a clearer picture of how the shooting went down, detectives zero in on the why.
What was going on? What was the reason for the fight that started this whole shooting in the first place?
Detectives review both previously obtained and new witness statements and zero in on the same key information.
Many of people that police spoke to mentioned the event that happened earlier that night. They all said it seemed to involve a man named Devontae Fowler, a high school friend of Monterio Barnes who had gone with him to the club.
There was a beef that happened with the person that my son was with that night. All I know is that Devontae Fowler, call him Woo Woo, he had a disagreement with those guys about something.
It's two fights. One before the club, one during the club.
We do know that there was a fight that ensued between Devontae Fowler and Stephen Brimlett, and that Stephen got knocked out by Devontae.
Stephen Brimlett and Chauncey Thomas were friends. And after that, he was telling everyone that he was going to knock Woo Woo out in retaliation.
Chauncey was going to just fight Devontae. Like, we were gonna brawl it out, but no gun stuff.
Monterio Barnes wasn't a part of any of this. He wasn't on hand for the first fight, and he had no skin in the game for the second fight. Munchie didn't have no problems with nobody. Like, he didn't beef with nobody. He never been in a fight before. Never.
Detectives determined from witnesses' accounts that it was KK's idea to take the fight to the next level, and Deja was willing to help.
Kalius brought a gun to a fist fight. I don't know if it was alcohol-induced or what, but he's the one that decided to shoot.
Once KK decided to bring weapons into it, he had to get them past security and that's where Deja got involved. She helped him sneak the gun in.
With a mountain of evidence in hand, police intensify their search for Calius Lane and Deja Giles.
There was a warrant for Calius Lane's arrest for murder and for battery at the basement.
His name is going up on all the news outlets. We need to find Calius Lane.
Authorities would soon get the break they'd been waiting for.
An anonymous tipster called Crime Stoppers and reported that Deja and Calius were on their way to Texas.
This couple was like Bonnie and Clyde. They were on the run, but their time was running out.
Days after the death of Monterio Barnes, police are zeroing in on the location of the shooter, Calius KK Lane and his girlfriend, Deja Giles.
The police had issued a bolo for Calius and Deja, and their names were all over the news, with a reward offered to anyone with information about their whereabouts. The police didn't have any information about their whereabouts until a tip came in that they had escaped on a megabus.
They were taking the megabus to North Texas.
Deja's mother lived in Texas, near Dallas, so that's probably why they're headed there.
They were staying in an abandoned house for a whole day. My homegirl, she knew exactly the exact location, like the exact address. So she hit me up. Do you think Deja gonna go to Texas? I'm like, oh yeah, that's exactly where they going. She like, well, I got the address. She talked to the police. They went straight and got him. I don't even think it was a full 24 hours that he was picked up. Remind you, they had to get there, so the house was vacant. They didn't even have water. They were staying like savages because it was a vacant house.
After just a few days on the run, Deja and Calius are apprehended. Once in custody, Calius refuses to speak to detectives.
He invoked his right to counsel and no statement was given.
When Deja is interviewed by police, she maintains that the couple were never on the run at all.
She admitted going to Texas with Calius after the shooting.
She says that it would have been just because they were already moving there.
Detectives aren't buying it.
Law enforcement decided to obtain a warrant for the arrest of Deja for hindering apprehension because she fled with Calius Lane to Texas.
Calius Lane is charged with first-degree murder.
I'm thinking they got Chauncey and they got KK. They got the two guys involved in the shooting. Now we're going to be able to go to trial and get the ball rolling on this whole thing.
The prosecutors have a lot left to iron out in order to secure convictions.
The basement case is a very complex case, and one of the things that we would have to work on or wait on, prepare for, is the physical evidence that was retrieved from the scene. It typically takes a number of months for all of the evidence to be processed.
Throughout the investigation, one piece of the puzzle has remained out of reach: the identity of the other shooter.
From the forensics on the scene, we know that there were two guns being fired.
The other shooter was not caught on camera.
But we had one individual who identified Chauncey Thomas as the other shooter.
Scouring video evidence tells investigators another story.
In the direction that the shots were shot, the second shooter came from behind, which would have been in the direction of shooting towards Calius and Chauncey. So there's no way that Chauncey could have been the shooter.
If it wasn't Chauncey, like they initially suspected, then who was it?
After many, many months and interviewing many, many witnesses, we had a witness come to us and say that the security guard was the shooter.
he had a weapon, and from what I understand, he started shooting also.
I don't know. I can't get in Malik's head to tell you why he chose to do that, but it put him in a position of, I'm going to fire my firearm because someone is shooting in the direction that I am in.
After considering all the facts and evidence, Malik was not charged because the decision was made that he was acting in the defense of others.
Would probably be no different as an active shooter comes into Walmart and you have someone shoot the shooter, but you accidentally shoot other people. You are trying to shoot the shooter and disarm the shooter.
If Kalius Lane had not started shooting in the basement, none of this would ever have happened. And Monterio would still be alive.
Now, the key to holding Kalius Lane and Deja Giles accountable for her part in the killing lies with those closely associated with them.
Chauncey Jigga Thomas was set to be the star witness.
The prosecution had already pled Chauncey Thomas, and within his plea, he pled to hindering apprehension, and he received 60 months unsupervised probation for that. And part of his plea was that he would have to provide truthful testimony.
With a growing stockpile of evidence, prosecutors are confident they'll secure a conviction.
We have probably, in this case, the best evidence that you could ever get in a murder case, and that's video of somebody doing the act.
Monterio's family is looking forward to the trial. They're ready for their day in court.
I really and truly thought that it was going to go to trial because of the way that we were moving. But once we got close to that time, it would be a continuance, and they would have to push it back further. And it would be pushed back, 6, 7 months.
So we were a year and a half almost before we were going to be able to get to a trial. We were issuing subpoenas, and the prosecution and defense were making offers, trying to see what they can do.
It went on and on and on. Continuance, continuance, continuance.
Detectives are unable to recover the gun Kalius used.
There's this second shooter. We don't have a firearm. So yes, we do not know whose bullet killed Monterio.
And the case would take another unexpected turn.
I don't know why he would act this way.
That day in the courtrooms, it was awful. It was a slap in the face.
The courtroom was locked down, and the police had to come to the building, and it was terrifying.
For months, family and friends of Monterio Barnes, an innocent bystander caught in the crossfire of senseless violence, have anxiously awaited their day in court.
By all accounts, this was an open and shut case. But in the 11th hour, there were holes in the case regarding whose gun killed Monterio.
Prosecutors opt for a plea deal instead of a trial and meet with Monterio's family to break the news.
We told them what concerns we did have if we did present this in a trial.
The prosecuting attorney told me that he didn't think that a jury of my peer would have found him guilty.
That is why we ended up pleading it down to the murder in the second degree.
Kalius Lane's plea deal includes charges related to the other shooting victims.
We also did battery 1 for some of the victims that had been shot. So he did receive 30 years in the Arkansas Department of Corrections, and he'd be eligible for parole after a fourth of that time.
You killed somebody. That person wasn't taunting you. That person didn't have a gun on you. That person hadn't threatened you. And you literally, not once, not twice, possibly 3 times, you shoot this boy for nothing.
With time served and the possibility of parole, Kalius could be out in less than 10 years.
Deja Giles takes a plea deal for harboring a fugitive and receives a 36-month sentence.
The family was very upset that for the hand she played in it, that was a very light sentence.
At the plea hearing, Calius Lane and Deja Giles' behavior proves even more shocking.
So during the plea hearing, he did seem to have a lack of remorse for what these individuals had gone through, the family of Monterio.
That day in the courtrooms, it was awful. They talked back and forth with each other, KK and Deja. They were very, very disrespectful to my family in that courtroom. They cursed us. Deja very smart-mouthly said to me, "Sorry about your loss," and kissed at me.
Tensions escalated as Calius's supporters reacted to the sentencing.
That boy family wanted to attack my family and friends because he killed my son. They were done injustice, is what they said, because he didn't do nothing.
I don't know why he would act this way, but afterward, there was a dispute in the courtroom between, I assume, rival individuals. The courtroom was locked down, and the police had to come to the building, and it was terrifying.
We didn't pull the trigger. Y'all did, and you killed my son and wounded 6 other people.
Through it all, Deja Giles firmly stands by her man and their family.
I think that the reason why she helped Calius was her wanting to hold on to her family, hold on to that idea that I have my son and I have someone who, says they love me and, wants to be with me, who's been there for me.
You making poor decisions to be with a man or do what the man asks you to do because y'all are cool in the gang or whatever the case may be. But who's gonna raise your children?
Deja continues to hide behind the fantasy of a perfect family.
The sky over the Tremont neighborhood in Cleveland, Ohio, on May 6, 2013, was a deceptive, peaceful shade of cerulean, the kind of afternoon that promised the easy transition into a warm Midwestern spring. It was a Monday, the kind of day where the mundane rhythms of a working-class community usually hummed like a low-frequency radio in the background. On Seymour Avenue, the air was filled with the familiar cacophony of a city breathing, the rhythmic rattling of an older car's engine as it navigated the cracked asphalt, the distant, staccato barking of a dog behind a chain-link fence, and the faint, sweet smell of charcoal smoke beginning to rise from someone's early evening grill. Children were pedaling their bicycles down the sidewalks, their laughter punctuating the humid air, while neighbors sat on their sagging porches, nodding to one another with a casual, practiced indifference that comes from years of living in close proximity. In the middle of this unremarkable block stood number 2207, a narrow, 2-story house with faded siding and a front porch that seemed to lean slightly under the weight of its own secrets. To anyone walking by, it was just another house on a street filled with them, a little cluttered, perhaps, with the windows obscured by heavy, mismatched curtains and plywood, but in a neighborhood where many homes bore the scars of the Rust Belt's economic decline, it didn't stand out as anything particularly sinister. It was a house that had mastered the art of being invisible in plain sight, a silent fortress hidden within the very fabric of a bustling community. The owner of the house, Ariel Castro, was a man who had perfected the role of the mundane neighbor. A school bus driver by trade and a bass player in local Latin bands by passion, he was known around Tremont as someone who was perhaps a bit eccentric, a bit of a loner, but ultimately harmless. He was the man you'd see parking his motorcycle on the sidewalk or carrying bags of groceries into his home alone, never lingering too long for a conversation, but offering a quick wave that discouraged further inquiry. He was part of the neighborhood scenery, a fixed point in the local geography that no one thought to question. But on this specific afternoon, as the sun began to cast long, golden shadows across the street, a hairline fracture appeared in the carefully maintained facade of number 2207. For the first time in over a decade, the predator had made a mistake, a single, catastrophic lapse in his ritual of control. He had walked out of the house, heading for a quick errand or a rehearsal, and he had forgotten to engage the heavy, interior deadbolt of the outer aluminum storm door. It was a tiny error, a mere oversight of a few inches of metal, but it was the crack in the armor that 11 years of prayers had been waiting for. Inside the house, the atmosphere was a stark, suffocating contrast to the vibrant afternoon outside. Behind the boarded-up windows and the layers of heavy fabric, the air was stagnant, tasting of recycled breath, old dust, and the metallic tang of unwashed bodies. There was no sense of time here, only the dim, jaundiced glow of a few low-wattage bulbs and the oppressive weight of a silence that had been enforced by years of violence. Amanda Berry, a woman who had entered this house as a 16-year-old girl and was now 26, stood in the shadows of the living room, her heart hammering against her ribs with such force it felt like a trapped bird. She had noticed the subtle change in the light filtering through the gap in the door, a sliver of real, unfiltered sunshine that shouldn't have been there. She approached the door with a mixture of terror and a sudden, electric surge of hope that made her limbs tremble. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cold surface of the interior door, and when she pushed, it gave way just an inch. The secondary storm door was still closed, but it wasn't locked. Through the small gap, she could see the world she had been stolen from. The sidewalk, the trees, and the movement of people who had no idea she was only feet away. The emergence of Amanda Berry onto the porch of 2207 Seymour Avenue was not a cinematic moment of triumph, but a raw, desperate eruption of the human spirit. She didn't have the strength to force the door open entirely, so she began to scream. It was a sound that had no place in the quiet afternoon, a hollow, guttural wail that seemed to carry the weight of 3,600 days of captivity. Across the street, Charles Ramsey was sitting in his living room, nursing a half-eaten McDonald's burger, when the sound reached him. At first, he thought it was a domestic dispute, the kind of noise you hear and try to ignore for the sake of neighborhood peace. But the scream didn't stop. It intensified, becoming a frantic, high-pitched plea that cut through the sounds of the street like a jagged blade. He looked out his window and saw a woman he didn't recognize, her face pale and etched with an intensity that made him drop his food and run toward the porch. He found her reaching through a small hole at the bottom of the door, her hand clawing at the air, her voice a frantic whisper as she told him that she was Amanda Berry, that she had been kidnapped, and that she had been in that house for a very, very long time. The name Amanda Berry acted like a physical shock to Ramsey and the other neighbors who were beginning to gather. In Cleveland, that name was a ghost, a memory of a girl who had vanished on her way home from work at a Burger King 10 years earlier, just a day before her 17th birthday. To hear it spoken now, by a woman standing on Ariel Castro's porch, was like watching the dead return to life. Ramsey, a man of quick action and a colorful vocabulary, didn't hesitate. He realized the door was jammed or locked from the inside in a way that wouldn't let her through, so he and another neighbor, Angel Cordero, began to kick at the bottom of the door. They weren't just breaking through aluminum and wood. They were dismantling a decade of absolute control. With a final, splintering crash, the bottom panel of the door gave way, creating a jagged aperture just large enough for a person to crawl through. Amanda emerged from the darkness of the house like a survivor of a shipwreck, her clothes worn, her eyes blinking rapidly against the unaccustomed glare of the sun, and she was clutching a small, 6-year-old girl in her arms, a child born in the shadows of that house, who was seeing the sky for the first time in her life. The scene on the sidewalk was a chaotic, surreal tableau of human emotion. Amanda was sobbing, her body shaking with a combination of adrenaline and the sheer, overwhelming reality of being free. Neighbors stood in stunned silence, their hands over their mouths, as they watched this woman who had been a missing poster for a decade suddenly materialize in their midst. She didn't stop to explain. She didn't have time for the questions that were already bubbling up in the minds of the crowd. She ran to the house of another neighbor, desperate for a telephone. When the dispatcher answered the 911 call, they were met with a voice that was both frantic and remarkably clear. Amanda identified herself, repeating her name as if she needed the world to confirm it was still hers. She told the operator that she had been kidnapped, that she had been missing for 10 years, and that she was finally free. She warned the police to come quickly, because she knew the man who had stolen her life would be back, and she knew that she wasn't the only one still trapped behind those boarded-up windows. As the first sirens began to wail in the distance, a sound that usually signaled trouble but now felt like a choir of angels, the true horror of number 2207 began to crystallize. Amanda had told the neighbors that there were other women inside, names that were just as legendary in the annals of Cleveland's tragedies, Gina DeJesus and Michelle Knight. The neighborhood, which had lived alongside Ariel Castro in a state of oblivious peace, was suddenly transformed into a site of unimaginable trauma. People began to look at the house with new eyes, seeing the boards on the windows not as signs of poverty, but as the bars of a prison. They thought of the times they had seen Castro on his porch, the times he had offered a polite nod, and the realization that while they were watching television or eating dinner, 3 women were being subjected to a living hell just a few dozen feet away. The collective guilt and shock of the community was a palpable, heavy presence, a psychic wound that was opening in real time as the police cruiser screeched to a halt at the curb. The officers who first entered the house didn't know what they would find, but they moved with a grim, focused urgency. They stepped over the threshold and into a different world, a place where the rules of the civilized world had been suspended for 11 years. The interior was a labyrinth of makeshift walls, reinforced doors, and a tangle of chains and padlocks that looked more like something out of a medieval dungeon than a residential home. As they moved through the dim, cluttered rooms, the smell hit them, a thick, stagnant miasma of neglect and long-term confinement. In the upper floors, they found them. Gina DeJesus, who had vanished at the age of 14 while walking home from school, and Michelle Knight, the first to be taken in 2002, who had been forgotten by almost everyone except the monster who held her. They were found in darkened rooms, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a dawning, fragile hope as the beams of the officers' flashlights cut through the gloom. They weren't just being rescued, they were being pulled back from a void that had swallowed their entire adult lives. The hook of the Ariel Castro case is not just the brutality of the kidnapping or the duration of the captivity, it is the terrifying proximity of the horror to the mundane. It is the story of a man who could drive a school bus full of children during the day and return home to a house of horrors at night. It is the story of 3 women who refused to let their spirits be crushed, who formed a sisterhood in the dark, and who eventually found the strength to claw their way back into the light. This is a narrative that challenges our understanding of safety, of community, and of the masks that predators wear in our everyday lives. As we prepare to delve into the boi can of Seymour Avenue and the heartbreaking Chandung of the victims, we must hold onto the image of Amanda Berry's hand reaching through that broken door. It is a symbol of the ultimate resilience of the human will, a spark of light that managed to survive in a place where the sun was never supposed to shine again. The atmospheric weight of that afternoon in May 2013 continues to haunt the memory of Cleveland. It was the day the City of Ghosts gave up its most painful secrets, and the day the world had to confront the reality that monsters don't always live in the woods or the shadows. Sometimes they live right next door, and they even offer you a wave as they go about their day. The investigation would eventually reveal a faux die of psychological and physical torture, a series of false walls and hidden alarms designed to keep the world out and the victims in. But for this opening moment, the focus remains on the scream that broke the silence. It was a scream that traveled through 10 years of airless rooms and locked doors to finally find a listener. It was the sound of justice beginning to grind its gears, and the sound of a neighborhood realizing that the slightly odd man on the motorcycle was the architect of a nightmare beyond their wildest imagination. As the victims were led out of the house, shielded by blankets and the protective arms of the officers, the crowd on Seymour Avenue stood in a state of suspended animation. The joy of the rescue was tempered by the sheer, sickening gravity of what had happened inside those walls. They watched as the women who had been frozen in time on missing posters finally walked onto the pavement, their steps hesitant, their bodies bearing the invisible scars of a decade of abuse. The House of Horrors stood behind them, its jaundiced siding now a monument to a systemic failure and an individual's depravity. The sirens continued to wail, a constant, urgent reminder that the world was now watching and that the story of number 2207 was no longer a secret. It was a tragedy that would be picked apart by the media, analyzed by psychologists, and mourned by a nation, but at its heart, it would always be the story of 3 girls who became women in a cage and then found the key. The psychological analysis of Ariel Castro begins here, in the contrast between his public life and his private prison. He was a man who craved control above all else, a man who viewed human beings as property to be collected and managed. He used the noise of the neighborhood, the loud music, the barking dogs, the industrial hum of the city, to mask the sounds of his crimes. He was a master of the hidden in plain sight technique, leveraging the social apathy and the economic struggles of the neighborhood to ensure that no one looked too closely at his boarded-up windows. He played on the inherent trust of his community, using his role as a bus driver and a musician to build a bridge of normalcy that led directly to his house of death. This was a predator who didn't hunt in the dark. He hunted in the afternoon, on the streets where everyone knew his name, and he succeeded for 11 long years. The message of the Ariel Castro case is one of both profound darkness and incredible light. It reminds us that there are voids in our society where the vulnerable can slip through, and that our systems of protection are often far more fragile than we want to admit. But it also shows us the power of a single moment of courage. Amanda Berry's decision to scream, Ramsey's decision to listen, and the community's decision to help. These were the actions that ended the nightmare. As we move from the Hook into the BOI Ken of the Tremont neighborhood, we must remember the sensory details of that day. The taste of the burger Ramsey dropped, the feel of the splintering wood of the door, and the sound of a 911 call that changed everything. The story of number 2207 is a journey from the heart of darkness into the light of a new day, and it begins with the realization that even in a house of ghosts, the living can still find a way to speak. The final image of this opening chapter is the site of the house at 2207 Seymour Avenue being surrounded by crime scene tape, a bright yellow ribbon that officially transformed a home into a tomb. The world was now peering into the rooms where the windows had been sealed with caulk and the doors reinforced with steel bars. They were finding the chains, the diaries of despair, and the evidence of a man who had tried to play God in a 2-story frame house. The Hook is set not just in the horror, but in the miraculous nature of the escape. It is a story that asks us to look at our own neighborhoods with more attentive eyes, and to never underestimate the strength of those who are fighting battles we cannot see. The silence of Seymour Avenue was broken on May 6, 2013, and the echoes of that scream are still being felt today, a haunting, rhythmic reminder that hope is a flame that even the deepest darkness cannot fully extinguish. As the sun finally set on that historic day, the residents of Cleveland began to process the magnitude of what had been discovered in their midst. The House of Horrors was no longer a secret, and Ariel Castro was no longer a neighbor. He was a target of a global manhunt that would end just hours later. But for the 3 women who had finally breathed the fresh air of an Ohio evening, the long road to recovery was just beginning. They were free from the chains, but the memories of number 2207 would follow them forever. Their story is a testament to the fact that while a monster can steal your time and your body, your soul remains your own. This is the beginning of the end for Ariel Castro, and the beginning of a new, hard-won life for the women of Seymour Avenue. The Hook is the survival, the discovery is the truth, and the aftermath is the enduring power of the human spirit to rise from the ashes of a decade of darkness. To understand the horrific reality of what transpired behind the walls of 2207 Seymour Avenue, one must first immerse themselves in the unique, paradoxical atmosphere of the Tremont neighborhood in Cleveland, Ohio, during the dawn of the 21st century. Tremont was a place defined by its layers of history, a working-class enclave that had seen the rise and fall of the great American industrial machine. It was a neighborhood of steep-stepped porches, narrow alleyways, and a skyline punctuated by the domes of historic churches and the distant, skeletal remains of the steel mills along the Cuyahoga River. By the early 2000s, Tremont was caught in a strange state of transition, a mixture of old-world grit and the first whispers of urban revitalization. On one corner, you might find a trendy new gallery, and on the next, a house where the paint had been flaking off for 3 decades. Seymour Avenue sat squarely in the heart of this duality. It was a high-density residential street where the houses were huddled together like weary travelers, their eaves almost touching, creating a sense of forced intimacy that should have made secrets impossible to keep. The physical setting of Seymour Avenue was a landscape of constant, low-level sensory overload. In the humid heat of an Ohio July, the air was a thick, stagnant soup of exhaust from the nearby I-90 highway and the faint, muddy scent of the river. The street was never truly quiet. It was a theater of urban sounds. You had the rhythmic, percussive thumping of car stereos as people cruised the block, the shrill whistles of the wind whipping through the power lines, and the constant background hum of a city that was always in motion. This was a neighborhood where people lived on their porches. Life happened in the open. Neighbors knew the color of each other's cars, the time the mail arrived, and which kids were skipping school. It was the last place on earth where you would expect 3 women to vanish into thin air and remain just a few dozen feet from the sidewalk for over a decade. The setting was the perfect camouflage because it was too busy, too noisy, and too familiar to be suspicious. Number 2207 was a modest, 2-story frame house, typical of the architecture that flourished in Cleveland during the industrial boom. It was narrow and deep, stretching back into a small, overgrown lot. Over the years, the house began to take on a weary, defensive posture. The white siding faded to a dull, jaundiced gray, stained by the soot and grime of the city. But the most striking feature of the house was its lack of transparency. While the neighbors had wide, open windows that allowed the light of the street lamps to spill into their living rooms, the windows of 2207 were gradually being erased. First came the heavy, dark curtains, then the blankets, and eventually the plywood. It was a house that was slowly turning inward, withdrawing from the community like a wounded animal. Yet, in the context of Seymour Avenue, this wasn't necessarily a red flag. Many homes in the area were boarded up due to foreclosure or disrepair. The House of Horrors didn't look like a dungeon. It looked like a casualty of the economy. Ariel Castro, the master of this domain, was a fixture of the setting, as unremarkable and integrated as the telephone poles lining the street. He was a man who understood the power of the mundane. He drove a school bus, a bright, yellow symbol of safety and community trust, navigating the very streets where he would eventually hunt his prey. When he returned home, he would park his motorcycle on the sidewalk, a flashy, loud presence that drew the eye and diverted the mind. He was a musician, a bass player who brought the vibrant sounds of salsa and merengue to the neighborhood, often seen carrying his instrument cases in and out of the house. To the people of Tremont, Ariel was Tony, the guy who liked to play his music a little too loud and who seemed a bit obsessive about his privacy, but who was ultimately just another struggling soul in a struggling city. He used his public persona as a shield, a carefully constructed mask of normalcy that allowed him to walk through the world with the confidence of a man who knew he was being watched but never truly seen. The internal setting of the house was a mirror image of the neighborhood's external chaos, but twisted into a claustrophobic nightmare. Inside, the architecture of the home had been systematically redesigned to facilitate the absolute control of its inhabitants. Walls were reinforced, doors were replaced with heavy wood and steel, and a series of false partitions created a labyrinthine environment where sound was dampened and movement was restricted. The air inside 2207 was a dead, heavy substance. It didn't circulate. It merely sat, absorbing the smells of the people trapped within it. There was no natural light to mark the passage of the hours. The girls lived in a world of artificial twilights, lit by flickering bulbs that cast long, distorted shadows across the stained carpets and the piles of hoarded clutter that Castro used to further obscure the interior. This was a setting where the concept of home had been inverted. The walls didn't protect the residents from the world. They protected the world from the truth of what was happening inside. The proximity of the house to the sidewalk was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the setting. Only a few feet of cracked concrete separated the girls' prison from the daily lives of their neighbors. On a quiet night, if the wind was right, the sounds of the street could penetrate the plywood, the voices of people laughing, the sound of a basketball hitting the pavement, the siren of a distant ambulance. The girls could hear the world moving on without them. They could hear the neighborhood celebrating the very holidays they were missing. This proximity was a form of psychological torture, a constant reminder that they were being held captive in the middle of a crowd. The setting was a vacuum of silence created in the heart of a scream. Castro utilized the noise of the neighborhood as his ally. He knew that if a woman screamed, it would be swallowed by the barking dogs, the revving engines, and the music that blared from his own windows. He didn't need a secluded cabin in the woods. He had the perfect, noisy cover of Seymour Avenue. As the years stretched from 2002 to 2013, the setting of the house became a living record of the girls' endurance. The walls were etched with the marks of their presence, hidden diaries written in the margins of old newspapers or on the backs of discarded envelopes. The setting was a tomb for their youth, but it was also the site of a miraculous birth. In the middle of this dungeon, in a room where the windows were sealed with caulk and the doors were locked with multiple padlocks, a child was born. This added a new dimension to the setting, a small, innocent life growing up in a world of chains and shadows. To that little girl, the interior of 2207 wasn't a prison. It was her entire universe. She learned to speak, to play, and to dream within the confines of a house that was designed to erase her mother. The juxtaposition of a child's laughter and the sound of rattling chains is the show, don't tell, of the absolute depravity of the environment Castro had created. The passage of the seasons in Cleveland provided a brutal, rhythmic backdrop to the girls' captivity. The winters were long and punishing, the wind howling off Lake Erie and rattling the frame of the old house. Inside, the temperature would drop, the cold seeping through the cracks in the foundation, turning the basement and the unheated rooms into icy vaults. The girls would huddle together for warmth, their breath visible in the dim light. Then would come the humid, sweltering Ohio summers, when the air inside the house would become a pressurized kiln. The smell of the hoarded trash, the unwashed bodies, and the stagnant water would thicken until it was a physical barrier. There was no relief, no escape from the sensory assault of the environment. The setting was a relentless, 24-hour participant in their abuse, a physical manifestation of Castro's desire to degrade and dehumanize his victims. The socioeconomic setting of Tremont during these 11 years also played a crucial role in the girls' invisibility. This was a neighborhood where people were used to seeing odd things. A man boarding up his windows wasn't necessarily a cause for alarm. It was just a sign of the times. A house that smelled of neglect wasn't a crime scene. It was a symptom of poverty. The systemic apathy of a city struggling with its own identity created a gray space where a predator could flourish. The police were often overwhelmed, their resources spread thin across a metropolis plagued by more visible crimes. Missing person reports for young women from the neighborhood were often treated with a degree of skepticism, dismissed as runaways or troubled youths rather than victims of a targeted abduction. The setting of the investigation was defined by a lack of urgency, a belief that these girls had simply drifted away into the urban fog. To tell the story of the Seymour Avenue house is to tell the story of the invisibles. The girls were taken from streets that were just like the one they were held on. They were girls from the neighborhood, stolen by a man from the neighborhood, and kept in a house in the neighborhood. The horror lies in the fact that the setting was so ordinary. There were no secret tunnels leading miles underground, no high-tech surveillance systems, no hidden bunkers. It was just a house with a basement, a kitchen, and 3 bedrooms. It was the absolute banality of the setting that made it so effective. Castro didn't need to be a mastermind. He just needed to be a man who understood that if you act like you belong, and if you live in a place where people mind their own business, you can get away with anything. The setting was the cage, and the cage was a home. The psychological setting of the street was one of polite distance. Tremont was a community where people looked out for one another, but they also respected the private property of the individual. This respect for the threshold of the home was something Castro exploited to the fullest. He would stand on his porch and engage in small talk. He would offer to help a neighbor with their car, and he would even host small gatherings in his backyard. By being present in the community, he ensured that no one would ever feel the need to trespass. The setting was a social contract that he had signed in bad faith. He knew that the more he appeared to be a part of the street, the less likely anyone would be to look behind the plywood. This was the ultimate irony of Seymour Avenue. The very things that made it a strong community, the trust, the familiarity, and the shared history, were the things that allowed the monster to hide in plain sight. Inside the house, the setting was also a site of constant, low-grade psychological warfare. Castro would move the girls from room to room, changing the conditions of their confinement to keep them disoriented. He would leave the radio on for days at a time, playing the same station at a high volume to drown out the silence and to prevent them from communicating. He would leave the television on, forcing them to watch a world that they were no longer a part of, a world that seemed to have forgotten they ever existed. The setting was designed to make them feel like ghosts. It was a place where their identities were slowly being replaced by the roles Castro had assigned to them. This show, Don't Tell, of their mental state is found in the way they reacted to the sound of his key in the lock, the collective tensing of bodies, the lowering of eyes, and the absolute, terrified silence that would fall over the house. The physical decay of 2207 Seymour Avenue mirrored the moral decay of its owner. As the years passed, the house seemed to be sinking into the ground, the porch sagging further, the weeds in the backyard growing taller and more tangled. It was a house that was literally being consumed by its own secrets. The setting was a monument to the slow-motion destruction of 3 lives. Yet, through the cracks in the plywood and the gaps in the floorboards, the girls found ways to connect with the world. They looked through the peepholes they had scratched into the windows, watching the seasons change and the neighborhood grow. They held onto the sensory details of the street, the sound of the school bus, the smell of the rain, the sight of a neighbor's dog, using them as anchors to their own humanity. The setting was their prison, but it was also the only map they had to the world they wanted to return to. In May 2013, the setting of Seymour Avenue was finally, violently transformed. The sound of a kicking foot against a door, the splintering of wood, and the first, frantic breath of fresh air signaled the end of the nightmare. The house was no longer a secret. It was a crime scene. The neighborhood was no longer a place of oblivious peace. It was the epicenter of a global tragedy. The House of Horrors was revealed to be a feodie of chains and padlocks, a place where the air was indeed thick with the dust of 11 years of lost time. The setting had been the accomplice, but it was also the witness. Every scratch on the walls, every chain bolted to the floor, and every boarded window told the story that the girls had been trying to scream for a decade. The setting was the physical proof of Ariel Castro's depravity, and it was the final resting place of the monster he had become. The atmosphere of the street during the rescue was a mixture of absolute horror and a sudden, blinding light. People stood on their porches, the same porches where they had sat for 11 years, and watched as the ghosts of their neighborhood were pulled from the darkness. The setting was being reclaimed. The plywood was being torn down, the doors were being kicked open, and the truth was finally being allowed to breathe. The 2200 block of Seymour Avenue would never be the same. The house would eventually be leveled, the earth turned over, and the lot left empty, but the memory of the House of Horrors would remain etched into the geography of Cleveland forever. This was the setting of the Ariel Castro kidnappings, a normal house on a normal street where a normal man did the unthinkable, and where 3 extraordinary women found a way to survive the impossible. The tragedy of the Ariel Castro kidnappings is often told through the lens of the spectacular escape in 2013, a moment of blinding sunlight and shattered doors that captured the world's attention for a brief, sensational week. But to truly honor the 3 women who were held within that 2-story tomb on Seymour Avenue, we must move past the headlines of their rescue and into the vibrant, complicated lives they lived before the darkness descended. We must remember that Michelle Knight, Amanda Berry, and Gina De Jesus were not born as victims. They were daughters, sisters, and mothers with distinct personalities, fierce dreams, and a shared, tragic innocence that was exploited by a man they should have been able to trust. Their stories are a testament to the fact that a missing person is never just a face on a poster. They are a jagged hole in the fabric of a family, a constant, aching what if that remains frozen in time while the rest of the world continues to age. To look at their portraits is to look at the heart of Cleveland's West Side, a community defined by its grit and its deep, ancestral loyalties, but also by the cracks through which the vulnerable can all too easily slip. Michelle Knight was the first to be swallowed by the silence. In August 2002, she was 21 years old, but she carried the weight of a woman twice her age. Michelle's life had been a series of battles long before she ever crossed the threshold of 2207 Seymour Avenue. She was a young mother, a woman who lived for her toddler son, but she was caught in the suffocating gears of a custody dispute that threatened to take away the only thing that gave her world meaning. On the day she disappeared, the heat in Cleveland was a physical presence, a thick, humid pressure that made the asphalt of Lorraine Avenue feel soft underfoot. Michelle was stressed, her mind racing with the legal complexities of her upcoming court date, and she was wandering the neighborhood, perhaps looking for a moment of clarity or a familiar face. She was a petite woman, often described as having a fragile appearance, but those who knew her spoke of a stubborn, resilient core, a woman who wouldn't stop fighting for her child. The tragedy of Michelle's disappearance was compounded by a systemic failure that is a haunting indictment of how our society views its most marginalized. When she didn't return home, the police didn't launch a massive manhunt. They looked at her history, the custody battle, and her struggles with her family, and they made an assumption that would cost her a decade of her life. They decided she had simply run away, a woman who had finally buckled under the pressure and walked away from her responsibilities. Within 15 months, her name was quietly removed from the FBI's National Crime Information Center database. To the world, Michelle Knight had ceased to exist not because she was dead, but because the system decided she wasn't worth looking for. While she was being chained in a lightless basement just a few miles away, her disappearance was being categorized as a choice. This erasure is a show, don't tell, of the profound loneliness Michelle faced, a realization that even as she was being subjected to unspeakable horrors, the world had stopped calling her name. Amanda Berry's disappearance in April 2003 was a different kind of trauma for the city. It happened on the eve of her 17th birthday, a milestone that represents the ultimate threshold of American girlhood. Amanda was a vibrant, ambitious teenager who worked at a Burger King on West 110th Street, a girl who was well-liked by her peers and who was looking forward to her party with a frantic, youthful energy. She was the kind of girl who checked in with her mother, Lawana Miller, constantly. When she finished her shift and called her sister to say she was getting a ride home, it was the last time her family would hear her voice for 10 years. The ride she accepted was from a man she thought she knew, a man who seemed like a harmless figure from the neighborhood. In that single, split-second decision to trust a neighbor, the trajectory of her life was diverted into a nightmare that would last 3,600 days. The search for Amanda Berry was a high-decibel, high-visibility campaign that became a fixture of the Cleveland landscape. Her mother, Lawana, became a warrior of grief, a woman who refused to let the city forget her daughter. The yellow, missing posters with Amanda's smiling face, her hair styled, her eyes bright with the promise of 17, faded under the summer sun and wrinkled under the winter snows, but they were replaced again and again. Lawana Miller's struggle was a visceral, public performance of maternal love. She went on national television, she hounded detectives, and she walked the streets of the West Side until her health began to fail. People in the neighborhood remember seeing her, a woman who seemed to be physically shrinking under the weight of her loss. When Lawana died in 2006, 3 years into Amanda's captivity, the community felt a profound sense of injustice. A mother had died of a broken heart, never knowing that her daughter was still alive, still fighting, and still hoping to come home, just a few dozen blocks away. Gina De Jesus was the final piece of the Predator's collection, taken in April 2004 when she was only 14 years old. Gina was a quiet, sweet girl, a middle school student who was walking home from Wilbur Wright Middle School on a bright, spring afternoon. Her disappearance was perhaps the most chilling because it involved a direct betrayal of the social fabric. Gina was best friends with Arlene Castro, the daughter of the man who would steal her. On that afternoon, Gina was seen walking with Arlene, and when the two girls parted ways, Ariel Castro pulled up in his vehicle. He used the most powerful weapon in his arsenal, familiarity. He didn't need a mask or a weapon. He just needed a smile and a question about his daughter. Gina, a girl who had been taught to respect her elders and her friends' parents, got into the car believing she was safe. She was a child entering a trap set by someone who had been inside her own home, someone who had shared meals with her family. The impact of Gina's disappearance on the De Jesus family was a study in collective resilience. Her parents, Felix and Nancy, became pillars of hope in a neighborhood that was increasingly defined by fear. They turned their home into a headquarters for the search, a place where the light was never turned off. They held annual vigils, their voices rising in prayer through the cold April nights, their hands holding candles that flickered against the industrial backdrop of the West Side. Felix de Jesus would walk the neighborhood with a megaphone, calling his daughter's name, a sound that became a haunting, rhythmic part of the local atmosphere. Unlike the assumption made with Michelle, no one ever believed Gina had run away. The community knew her, they knew her family, and they knew that she had been stolen. This shared certainty created a different kind of pressure, a decade-long wait for a truth that seemed to be hiding in the very air they breathed. To understand these three women is to look at the show, Don't Tell, of their individual identities before they were merged into a single narrative of survival. Michelle was the survivor of a hardscrabble life, a woman who found her joy in the eyes of her son. Amanda was the girl on the cusp of womanhood, a social butterfly whose life was defined by the music, the fashion, and the frantic energy of the early 2000s. Gina was the innocent, a girl whose world was defined by school, family, and the bonds of friendship. Castro didn't just take three bodies. He took three distinct futures. He took the high school graduation Amanda never had, the quinceañera Gina never celebrated, and the childhood of the son Michelle was never allowed to raise. He curated a museum of lost time, holding on to them as if their lives were his to spend. The sensory details of their lives before the kidnappings helped to paint a picture of what was lost. Imagine the smell of the grease at the Burger King where Amanda worked, the sound of the school bell that Gina had just heard before she vanished, and the frantic, heavy breathing of Michelle as she hurried toward the courthouse. These were the sights and sounds of the world they belonged to. In the 2200 block of Seymour Avenue, these memories became their only currency. They spoke to each other through the walls, sharing fragments of their pasts to keep their identities from dissolving. They remembered the taste of a home-cooked meal, the feel of the wind on their faces, and the names of the people who loved them. In the dark, they weren't just captives, they were the keepers of their own histories, fighting a daily battle against the man who wanted to turn them into nameless, compliant shadows. The portrait of the victims also requires a psychological analysis of the man who chose them. Ariel Castro didn't strike at random. He was a predator of opportunity who understood the geography of the neighborhood's vulnerabilities. He chose girls who he believed would not be missed, or whose disappearances would be explained away by the chaos of their lives. He watched the patterns of the streets from the elevated seat of his school bus, a mobile observation tower that allowed him to identify the solitary walks and the moments of isolation. He exploited the very things that made the community strong, the trust, the familiarity, and turned them into a mechanism of abduction. He was a man who lived in the cracks, and he knew exactly which girls were standing near the edge. As the years turned into a decade, the Chandang Nan Nan shifted from the vibrant images on the missing posters to the reality of the women inside the house. They were forced to adapt to a world of absolute, arbitrary violence. Michelle, the eldest and the first taken, often bore the brunt of Castro's initial rage, a woman who was subjected to horrific physical abuse that resulted in multiple lost pregnancies. This detail is a show, Don't Tell, of the absolute brutality of their confinement, a record of lives that were literally beaten out of existence before they could even begin. Yet, even in the middle of this horror, Michelle became a protector, a sister to the younger girls who arrived after her. She was the one who helped Amanda deliver her child in 2006, a moment of profound, terrifying beauty in a place where only death was supposed to grow. This birth was the ultimate act of defiance against the setting Castro had created. It was the introduction of a new life that had no choice but to be an anchor for the hope of the others. The psychological landscape of their captivity was a constant negotiation with the concept of normalcy. Castro would force them to celebrate holidays, providing a grotesque mimicry of the lives they had lost. He would bring in a cake for a birthday or a gift for Christmas, a performance of family that was designed to further disorient and control them. This was a show, don't tell, of his desire to not just be a kidnapper, but to be a god of his own small, dark world. He wanted to be the provider, the punisher, and the only point of contact for their reality. But the women refused to accept his version of the world. They held on to the truth of who they were. They celebrated their own internal milestones, counting the days, the months, and the years with a meticulous, desperate accuracy. They remained the daughters of Felix and Nancy, the daughter of Luana, and the mother of a son who was growing up in a world they could no longer see. The community of Cleveland, meanwhile, was undergoing its own slow-motion trauma. The missing girls became a part of the city's folklore, a reminder of the darkness that could swallow a child in broad daylight. The West Side was a place of vigils and prayers, a neighborhood that was always looking over its shoulder. The missing posters became faded and torn, eventually blending into the background of the urban landscape like a layer of old wallpaper. This fading is a powerful metaphor for the way society handles long-term loss. We want to remember, but the demands of the present eventually force us to look away. But the families never looked away. They kept the rooms of their daughters exactly as they had left them, a physical manifestation of a hope that refused to die. The posters might have faded, but the aching void in their homes remained as sharp as a razor. When we look at the Chandung of Michelle, Amanda, and Gina, we must also see the child, Jocelyn, who was born into the house in 2006. To the world, she was a symbol of Castro's depravity, but to Amanda, she was a reason to survive. The child was the only person in that house who had never known anything else, a little girl who saw the boarded-up windows as her horizon. She was the catalyst for the ultimate escape. Amanda knew that she couldn't allow her daughter to spend another decade in the dark. The victim story thus becomes a story of a mother's fierce, protective love, a narrative that began with Michelle fighting for her son in 2002 and ended with Amanda fighting for her daughter in 2013. The cycle of maternal devotion was the one thing Castro could not break. The three women of Seymour Avenue represent a collective profile of endurance that defies the limits of human psychology. They were subject to a systematic effort to erase their names, their bodies, and their minds. They lived in a place where the sun never reached, and where the only voice they heard was the one that told them they were nothing. But when Amanda Berry stepped onto that porch in May 2013, she wasn't a shadow. She was a woman who knew exactly who she was. She was Amanda. She was free. And she was going home. The Chandung Nan Nan is not a picture of three broken souls. It is a picture of three warriors who survived the abyss and brought back a piece of their humanity to share with a world that had almost forgotten to look for them. Their faces, as they emerged from the house, were etched with a decade of lost light, but their eyes held a strength that was unyielding. Michelle Knight, the forgotten one, would eventually find her voice as a powerful advocate for others who had been lost. Gina De Jesus would return to the embrace of a family that had never stopped lighting candles. Amanda Berry would become a mother in the light, raising the daughter who had been her only companion in the dark. Their stories are a reminder that behind every house of horrors is a human history that deserves to be told with dignity and depth. They were more than the chains that held them. They were the dreams of Cleveland, the daughters of the West Side, and the ultimate proof that the light of the human spirit can never be fully extinguished, no matter how heavy the plywood or how strong the lock. As the house at 2207 Seymour Avenue was eventually dismantled and the earth was cleared, the memory of the three women remained as a permanent part of the neighborhood's conscience. They are no longer the missing girls. They are the survivors who taught a city how to hope. Their portraits are now painted in the colors of freedom, their names spoken with a reverence that acknowledges the sheer magnitude of their struggle. To tell their story is to perform an act of restoration, pulling them out of the statistics and back into the vibrant, complicated reality of their own lives. They were Michelle, Amanda, and Gina, the three women who refused to become ghosts and whose names will forever be a testament to the power of the human will to overcome the heart of darkness. The horror of Seymour Avenue did not begin with a single explosion of violence, but with a series of quiet, predatory interceptions that transformed the mundane geography of Cleveland's West Side into a map of absolute despair. To understand the incident phase of the Ariel Castro kidnappings, one must envision the chillingly methodical way a predator utilizes the rhythms of a city to identify and harvest his prey. Ariel Castro was not a monster who lurked in the dark woods. He was a man who operated in the high noon glare of the Midwestern sun, using a school bus as his observation tower and a friendly, familiar smile as his primary weapon. The incidents were not random acts of impulse, but calculated thefts of human life, occurring on streets where the victims felt most secure, orchestrated by a man who knew exactly how to exploit the trust and the vulnerabilities of his own community. The first thread in this dark tapestry was pulled on August 23, 2002. The air in Cleveland that day was a stagnant, heavy weight, a typical late summer humidity that made the asphalt feel like it was vibrating under the midday sun. Michelle Knight, 21 years old, and carrying the immense psychological burden of a looming custody battle, was walking near the intersection of West 106th Street and Lorraine Avenue. She was a woman in a state of high-alert anxiety, her mind focused on the legal papers and the desperate need to prove she was a fit mother. This was the specific kind of vulnerability that Castro hunted, a person whose focus was elsewhere, someone whose desperation made them more likely to accept a shortcut or a helping hand. When the green Ford van pulled alongside her, the man behind the wheel didn't look like a threat. He looked like a solution. The capture of Michelle Knight was an exercise in the show, don't tell, of predatory manipulation. Castro didn't use force. He used the promise of a puppy. He told her he had a dog that needed a home, a gentle hook designed to appeal to Michelle's nurturing instincts and her need for a moment of lightness in a dark week. As she climbed into the passenger seat, the smell of the van, a mixture of old coffee, stale upholstery, and the metallic scent of a vehicle that spent its days in the city's exhaust, should have been a warning, but the door closed with a solid, final thud that masked the sound of the trap snapping shut. The incident occurred not when the vehicle moved, but when the power dynamic shifted. As they drove towards Seymour Avenue, the conversation changed from puppies to a chilling, authoritative silence. When they reached the house, the hospitality was the lure that led her into the dark hallway. Once the front door was locked and the heavy interior deadbolt was engaged, the man the neighborhood knew as Tony vanished, replaced by a warden who viewed Michelle not as a human being, but as a piece of property to be stored. The transition for Michelle was instantaneous and brutal. She was led to the basement, a space that smelled of damp concrete and stagnant air, where the only light came from a single, low-wattage bulb that cast long, skeletal shadows across the floor. This was the moment the abduction turned into an incarceration. The sound of a chain being pulled across the floor, the metallic clinking of a padlock, and the sudden, overwhelming realization that the world outside was continuing without her. These were the sensory markers of her new reality. The incident was a total erasure of her previous life. In the dark of that first night, as she lay on the cold floor, she could hear the muffled sounds of the neighborhood, the cars on Seymour Avenue, the distant barking of a dog, and the proximity of the normal world was a form of psychological torture that would last for the next 11 years. 8 months later, on April 21, 2003, the predator struck again, this time targeting the very heart of the community's youthful hope. The eve of Amanda Berry's 17th birthday was a day of electric anticipation. The spring air was crisp, carrying the scent of rain and the first hints of blooming lilac. Amanda had finished her shift at Burger King and was walking home, her mind filled with the plans for her party and the excitement of the milestone she was about to reach. She was a girl of the neighborhood, a social butterfly who felt at home on these streets. When Ariel Castro's vehicle pulled up, it wasn't a stranger approaching. It was a man who lived just a few blocks away, someone whose face was part of the local scenery. He offered her a ride, a simple, neighborly gesture that Amanda accepted with the casual trust of a teenager who believed she knew her world. The incident for Amanda was a slow-motion realization of betrayal. As the car turned onto Seymour Avenue instead of toward her home, the atmosphere inside the vehicle thickened with a sudden, suffocating tension. The friendly neighbor was gone, his gaze now fixed on the road with a terrifying, blank intensity. He pulled into the driveway of 2207, and the small, ordinary house became the final destination of her childhood. Amanda was led inside, her confusion rapidly turning into a cold, paralyzing terror as she saw the boarded-up windows and the reinforced doors. She was taken to the upper floor, a place where the air was even thinner, the windows sealed with caulk and the curtains replaced by plywood. The incident wasn't just a kidnapping, it was a theft of her womanhood. On the night she was supposed to be celebrating her 17th year, she was being introduced to a world of chains and darkness, a world where her only companion was the silence of the room and the distant, mocking sound of the school bus she had seen Castro drive just days before. The final capture occurred on April 2nd, 2004, and it represented the ultimate perversion of the community's social bonds. Gina De Jesus was only 14, a child walking home from school with her best friend, Arlene, Castro's daughter. The walk was a ritual of innocence, a time for gossip and laughter under the pale Ohio sun. When the two girls parted ways, and Castro pulled up a few moments later, he was utilizing the most powerful weapon in his arsenal, the father figure mask. He asked Gina if she had seen Arlene, a question that drew on her loyalty to her friend and her respect for a parent. Gina got into the car without a second thought. To her, this was Arlene's dad, a man who had been in her home, someone who was a part of her safe, familiar universe. The betrayal of Gina De Jesus is the show, don't tell, of Castro's absolute depravity. He didn't just take a girl, he took his own daughter's friend. As they drove toward the house, he maintained the facade for a few agonizing minutes, even as the route diverged from the one that would take her home. The moment they stepped inside 2207, the mask was discarded. Gina was led to a room where she found herself face-to-face with the reality that the world she lived in was a lie. The incident for Gina was a shattering of the fundamental trust between a child and an adult. She was placed in a room next to Amanda and Michelle, a three-woman gallery of the lost, and the house of Seymour Avenue was officially complete. The incidents were over, and the decade of endurance had begun. The sensory experience of these captures was defined by a terrifying transition from the outside to the inside. On the street, there was light, movement, and the sounds of life. Inside the house, there was only the stagnant, pressurized air of a tomb. Castro had designed the interior to be a sensory vacuum. The walls were lined with heavy blankets to dampen the sound. The windows were sealed to prevent even a sliver of natural light from entering, and the doors were equipped with multiple locks and alarms that chirped with a mechanical, taunting frequency every time he moved through the house. The incident phase was a process of dehumanization, where the girls were stripped of their names, their clothes, and their autonomy, replaced by numbers and roles in Castro's twisted domestic play. The psychological weight of the capture was a form of atmospheric pressure that the girls felt in their very bones. Castro utilized a technique of unpredictable violence from the very beginning. He would be kind one moment, bringing them a meal or a small gift, and then erupt into a clinical, detached fury the next. This created a state of constant, low-level terror that made the physical chains almost secondary. The incident was a daily occurrence, a repetitive cycle of abuse that was designed to break their will and to make them believe that the world outside had forgotten them. He would tell them that their families had stopped looking, that the police had closed their files, and that he was the only person who still cared for them. This gaslighting was the true House of Horrors, a place where the truth was a commodity that only the predator possessed. As the years turned from 2002 to 2004, the three incidents merged into a single, cohesive nightmare. The girls became a sisterhood of the dark, communicating through the walls and floorboards, sharing their memories like precious fragments of a lost civilization. They remembered the specific details of the days they were taken, the heat of August, the lilacs of April, and used those memories as anchors to their own humanity. The incident was a memory they revisited every day, a moment of, if only, that they turned over in their minds like a smooth stone. If only they hadn't taken that ride. If only they had walked a different way. If only they hadn't trusted the man with the bass guitar. The neighborhood of Tremont, meanwhile, continued its oblivious hum. People walked past 2207 every day, pushing strollers, walking dogs, and arguing about politics, never realizing that they were only a few feet away from a slaughterhouse of the human spirit. The show, Don't Tell, of the community's failure is found in the lack of suspicion. They saw the boards on the windows and assumed it was just poverty. They heard the loud music and assumed it was just a musician practicing. They saw the odd man and assumed he was just a loner. This environment of neglect was the ultimate accomplice to the incidents. Castro knew that in a city like Cleveland, you could hide a mountain of misery behind a layer of urban decay, and no one would ever look twice. The psychological profile of the capture phase shows a man who is obsessed with the collection. He didn't just want one victim, he wanted a harem of controlled lives. Each new incident was an escalation of his confidence and a refinement of his techniques. He learned how to manipulate the girls' fears, how to use them against each other, and how to create a hierarchy of suffering that kept them divided. He was a man who took pride in the organization of his house, treating the women as if they were pieces of equipment that needed to be maintained. This clinical detachment is the most terrifying part of the incident phase. It suggests a mind that had completely severed its connection to the concept of human suffering, viewing the screams and the tears as merely the sounds of the machine he had built. As we look at the specific details of the captures, we see a pattern of familiarity-based abduction. Castro didn't need to hunt in the shadows because he knew the light was the best place to hide. He used his role as a neighbor, a father, and a professional to bypass the natural defenses of his victims. He was a master of the small talk that led to a large-scale catastrophe. This is a vital lesson of the Ariel Castro case. The most dangerous predators are the ones who know our names and our children's names. They are the ones who offer a ride on a hot day or a hand with a heavy bag. The incident is not a sudden, violent eruption. It is a slow, methodical betrayal of the social contract. The atmosphere in the house during the early years of the captures was one of stagnant transition. The girls were in a state of suspended animation, their lives frozen at the ages of 21, 16, and 14. They watched the world through the peepholes they scratched into the plywood, seeing the neighborhood age while they remained in a timeless, lightless void. The incident was the moment they stopped being part of the world and started being part of the house. They became the ghosts of Seymour Avenue, their presence felt by no one but the man who had stolen them. The weight of this invisibility was a physical burden, a pressure that they had to fight every single day just to keep from disappearing entirely into the shadows. One of the most visceral examples of the horror of the capture phase was the way Castro used the girls' own biological needs against them. He would withhold food, water, and even light as a way of exerting control. He turned the basic elements of survival into a system of rewards and punishments. This show, Don't Tell, of his depravity is found in the way the girls had to learn to negotiate for the simplest of things, a moment of fresh air, a clean blanket, or a few minutes of radio. The house was a laboratory of suffering, and the incidents were the experiments. Castro was the observer, watching with a cold, unblinking curiosity as the girls struggled to maintain their sanity in an environment that was designed to destroy it. The incident phase of the Ariel Castro case is a study in the absolute power of the predator and the absolute resilience of the victim. It is a story of how a man can turn a home into a prison and how three women can turn a prison into a sanctuary for their own souls. As the years moved toward the eventual breakthrough in 2013, the memory of those first moments, The ride, the puppies, the question about Arlene remained the primary source of their pain and their strength. They knew exactly what they had lost, and they knew exactly what they were fighting to get back. The incidents were the beginning of a decade of darkness, but they were also the foundation of a sisterhood that would eventually shatter the doors of 2207 Seymour Avenue and bring the world to its knees. The final image of the capture phase is the sight of the house at night, the only light coming from the cracks in the plywood, a jaundiced, flickering glow that signaled the presence of the monster and his collection. The neighborhood was quiet, the stars were out, and the world was at peace. But inside that house, 3 women were counting the seconds, the minutes, and the hours, waiting for the moment when the silence would finally be broken. The incidents were over, the trap was set, and the House of Horrors was now a permanent part of the Cleveland landscape, a silent, boarded-up monument to the fragility of the American dream and the terrifying capacity for human cruelty to hide in plain sight. The psychological toll on the victims was a form of slow-motion murder. They were being killed every day, killed by the isolation, by the violence, and by the realization that their lives were being spent in a cage. But they refused to die. They held on to the names of their families, the songs of their youth, and the belief that someone, somewhere, was still looking for them. The incident was the moment they were taken, but it was not the moment they were defeated. They carried the memory of their capture like a jagged piece of glass, using it to cut through the lies and the manipulations of the man who held them. They were the survivors of the incidents, and their story is a testament to the fact that while a monster can steal your time, he can never truly steal your soul. As we move from the incidents into the discovery and the investigation, we must hold onto the visceral details of those first moments of betrayal. We must remember the heat of the van, the click of the lock, and the sound of a scream that was swallowed by the city. The story of Seymour Avenue is a narrative of absolute shadow, but it is also a narrative of the light that eventually finds its way into even the deepest abyss. The incidents were the start of the tragedy, but the escape would be the start of the legend. Michelle, Amanda, and Gina were the victims of a man who thought he was a god, but in the end, they were the ones who proved that the human spirit is the only truly untouchable thing in the universe. The arrival of the first Cleveland police cruisers on Seymour Avenue was not a quiet affair. It was an explosive, high-decibel intrusion that tore through the suburban silence like a jagged blade. On that late afternoon of May 6, 2013, the street was suddenly transformed into a theater of red and blue strobes, the rhythmic pulsing of the lights reflecting off the faded siding of the houses and the wide, terrified eyes of the gathering crowd. The first officers to arrive did not just find a woman who claimed to be Amanda Berry. They found a neighborhood in the middle of a psychic earthquake. Amanda was standing on a nearby porch, her body shaking with a primal, electric energy, clutching the 6-year-old girl who was her only anchor to reality. But as the officers moved toward the jaundiced, narrow frame of number 2207, the focus shifted from the miracle on the sidewalk to the dark, boarded-up mystery of the house itself. The air around the property felt different, heavy, stagnant, and vibrating with the weight of 11 years of suppressed screams. The officers who breached the threshold of Ariel Castro's home were entering a world where the laws of the sunlit world no longer applied. As they pushed through the front door, the first thing that hit them was not a sight, but a smell. It was a thick, cloying miasma that seemed to have been fermenting in the humid Ohio air for a decade, a mixture of old dust, unwashed skin, moldy drywall, and the metallic, sharp tang of prolonged human confinement. It was the scent of a tomb that was still inhabited. The interior was a labyrinth of hoarded clutter and architectural betrayal. Castro had not just lived here. He had engineered the space to be a sensory vacuum. Piles of discarded junk, old tires, broken electronics, stacks of yellowed newspapers acted as secondary walls, dampening sound and obscuring the true dimensions of the rooms. The light from the street was completely absent, replaced by the dim, jaundiced glow of a few low-wattage bulbs that flickered as if the house itself were struggling to breathe. As the officers moved toward the stairs, their flashlights cutting through the gloom, they began to encounter the physical manifestations of Castro's obsession with control. They found heavy, reinforced doors that had been fitted with multiple, oversized padlocks and industrial-grade chains that were bolted directly into the wooden frames. Every step they took deeper into the house revealed a new layer of the fortress. There were false partitions that led to nowhere and narrow corridors that felt like the throat of a predator. The sound of their own boots on the stained carpet seemed unnaturally loud, echoing in a space that had been designed to absorb noise. They reached the second floor, their hearts hammering against their ribs, the silence of the house becoming a physical pressure on their eardrums. In the darkness, the only sound was the rhythmic, mechanical chirping of a series of alarms Castro had installed to notify him of any movement, a sound that usually signaled the predator's return, but now heralded his downfall. Flashlight beams swept across the landing, landing on a door that was crisscrossed with heavy metal. From behind the wood, they heard it, a sound so faint it was almost a vibration. It was a whimper, a soft, terrified inhalation of air. When the officers forced the door, they found themselves staring into the wide, unblinking eyes of Gina de Jesus. She was sitting in a darkened corner, her body gaunt and her skin possessing a translucent, ghostly quality from a decade without the sun. She didn't move at first. She simply stared at the light as if it were a hallucination. The show, don't tell, of her trauma was in the way her hands were folded in her lap, her fingers interlaced so tightly the knuckles were white, a posture of absolute, ossified defense. She looked like a child frozen in time, her 14-year-old self still visible in the face of the 24-year-old woman she had become. But the discovery was far from over. In another room, tucked away behind more locks and more boards, they found Michelle Knight. If Gina was a ghost, Michelle was a shadow that had almost completely dissolved into the dark. She had been the first taken, the one the world had stopped looking for in 2002. She was found in a state of profound physical and psychological shock, her eyes reflecting a depth of suffering that made the veteran officers look away. The room she was in was a masterpiece of claustrophobia. The windows were not just boarded. They were sealed with caulk and draped in heavy, dark fabric that prevented even a sliver of natural light from entering. The walls were etched with the marks of her endurance, tiny, frantic scratches in the paint that counted the days, months, and years of her disappearance. The discovery of these two women, alive but fundamentally altered, was a visceral shock to the investigators, a realization that they were witnessing a miracle that was also a catastrophe. The forensic teams that moved into the house in the following hours began the grim task of mapping the House of Horrors. They found the hardware of the captivity, the heavy chains that had been used to tether the women to the floor and to the walls, the cold, iron links worn smooth by years of contact with human skin. They found the diaries of despair, letters Castro had written to himself, incoherent manifestos of a man who viewed his victims as property and his house as a private kingdom. In these writings, the show, don't tell, of his pathology was absolute. He spoke of his addiction to control, his need to collect these women, and his twisted justification for the violence he inflicted. These papers were scattered among the filth of the house, a paper trail of a mind that had completely severed its connection to the concepts of empathy and morality. Perhaps the most heartbreaking discovery was the evidence of the child's life within the prison. In the middle of this dungeon, the investigators found a small, makeshift play area for 6-year-old Jocelyn. There were a few toys, some colorful drawings pinned to the windowless walls, and a small mattress. This added a layer of profound tragedy to the scene. It showed that while the women were living in a hell, they had tried to create a version of a childhood for the little girl born into the dark. The contrast between the child's innocent artwork and the heavy chains bolted to the floor just feet away was a sensory assault that many of the investigators found impossible to process. The house was a museum of systemic cruelty, every room a different chapter in a decade-long saga of abuse, neglect, and the desperate, flickering hope of the human spirit. Outside, the atmosphere of Seymour Avenue had reached a boiling point. The neighborhood, which had lived alongside Ariel Castro in a state of oblivious peace for 11 years, was now reeling from the realization of its own blindness. People gathered at the police tape, their faces masks of shock and a growing, collective guilt. They watched as the black coroner's vans and the forensic trucks arrived, their engines humming a low-frequency soundtrack to the neighborhood's trauma. Neighbors remembered the times they had seen Castro on his porch, the times he had offered a polite nod or a wave, and the sickening reality that while they were eating dinner or watching television, 3 women were being subjected to a living nightmare just a few dozen feet away. The discovery had turned a quiet residential block into a site of global infamy, a place where the sausage factory, excuse of the neighborhood, the loud music, the barking dogs, was now seen as the cloak of a monster. The forensic processing of the house was a marathon of the macabre. The investigators moved with a slow, clinical precision, documenting the way the house had been modified to keep the world out and the victims in. They found the hidden alarms on the doors, the reinforced windows, and the way the basement had been turned into a staging area for the initial captures. Every discovery was a piece of a puzzle that revealed a predator of chilling consistency and extraordinary patience. Castro hadn't just kidnapped these women, he had ossified them within the architecture of his own life. He had built a fortress of silence in the middle of a crowd, leveraging the social apathy and the economic struggles of the neighborhood to ensure that his secrets remained buried behind the jaundiced siding of number 2207. The discovery phase was also a moment of reckoning for the city's institutions. As the names of the rescued women were broadcast around the world, Michelle Knight, Amanda Berry, Gina De Jesus, the files of the missing person reports were pulled from the stagnant piles at the precinct. The investigators found reports that had been filed and then forgotten, victims who had been categorized as runaways because they came from the wrong side of town. The discovery of the house was the discovery of a systemic failure that had allowed a predator to flourish in plain sight. The evidence in the house, the chains, the locks, the boarded windows, was a physical indictment of a society that had decided some people were invisible. The show, Don't Tell, was in the dust on the old missing person files, a layer of neglect that mirrored the dust on the floor of the rooms where the girls were kept. As the sun began to set on that historic day in May, the light casting long, skeletal shadows across the street, the scale of the horror was finally fully visible. 3 women and a child had been removed from the property, lives that had been reduced to forensic evidence. The discovery was over, but the investigation into the depth of Castro's depravity was only just beginning. The house stood empty, its windows dark, its door now guarded by the yellow tape of the law. It was a monument to a decade of darkness, a place where the air was still thick with the memory of the struggle and the resilience of those who survived. The discovery had turned Seymour Avenue into a wound that was now open for the whole world to see, a visceral reminder of what happens when we stop looking at each other. The sensory details of the crime scene would haunt the investigators for the rest of their lives. They would remember the feel of the cold iron chains, the sound of the mechanical alarms chirping in the dark, and the sight of Michelle Knight's hand reaching for the light of their flashlights. They would remember the way the house seemed to absorb the sounds of the neighborhood, turning the laughter of children and the revving of car engines into a distant, mocking hum. The discovery was a journey into the heart of a darkness that was both extraordinary and devastatingly ordinary. It was a house on a street, with a kitchen and a backyard, where a man did the unthinkable because he believed the world would never care enough to look. The final tally of the evidence in the house was a testament to the sheer duration of the nightmare. They found items from 2002, 2003, and 2004, fragments of the girls' previous lives that had been preserved in the stagnant air of the house. A faded backpack, a school textbook, a piece of clothing from a birthday party. These were the archaeological layers of a decade of theft. Each item was a show, don't tell, of a life that had been interrupted, a narrative that had been violently rewritten by a man with a school bus and a bass guitar. The discovery was the end of the silence, the moment the city of ghosts finally gave up its most painful secret, and the moment the 3 women of Seymour Avenue were finally allowed to reclaim their names. The 2200 block of Seymour Avenue was forever changed by the events of that day. The house would eventually be leveled, the earth turned over, and the lot left empty, but the memory of the House of Horrors remained etched into the geography of Cleveland. The discovery had proven that the most dangerous intruder is the one who lives next door, and that the most effective cage is the one built out of apathy and familiarity. As the last of the forensic teams packed their gear and the crowds finally began to disperse, the silence that returned to the street was different. It was no longer a silence of ignorance, but a silence of deep, collective trauma. The discovery was complete, and the hunt for justice for Michelle, Amanda, and Gina was now the only thing left to fill the void of Seymour Avenue. This phase of the investigation was the moment the Ariel Castro case moved from a local tragedy to a global symbol of resilience. It was the moment the world had to face the reality that monsters don't always look like monsters. The discovery at number 2207 was a tragedy in slow motion, a series of horrific reveals that stripped away the veneer of normalcy from the neighborhood. It was the sound of a kicking foot, the buzz of an alarm, and the sight of a woman walking into the light for the first time in 10 years. The discovery was the end of Ariel Castro's godhood and the beginning of a long, painful process of healing for the women who had survived his abyss. They were no longer the missing girls. They were the women who had seen the dark and found their way back. The investigation into the disappearances of Michelle Knight, Amanda Berry, and Gina De Jesus was a decade-long odyssey of systemic failure, tragic assumptions, and a series of missed opportunities that allowed a predator to remain invisible while living at the very center of the community's collective grief. In the early 2000s, the Cleveland Police Department was a force under siege, struggling to manage the violent churn of a city grappling with the decline of its industrial heart and the rising tide of urban decay. Within the cluttered, smoke-stained offices of the 4th District, the missing person files for these 3 girls were not seen as a singular, terrifying pattern, but as isolated incidents of marginalized lives drifting away into the gray Cleveland fog. The investigation into Michelle Knight, who vanished in August 2002, was effectively strangled at birth by a devastatingly common social bias. Because she was 21, a young mother from a troubled background, and embroiled in a high-stress custody battle, the detectives assigned to her case looked at her history and saw a runaway rather than a victim. They chose to believe a narrative of convenience, that she had simply buckled under the pressure and walked away from her life. The show, Don't Tell, of this investigative dead end was found in the physical reality of her file, which sat at the bottom of a stagnant pile, gathering a layer of dust that mirrored the city's indifference. When she was removed from the FBI's National Crime Information Center database only 15 months after she was taken, it was the ultimate investigative erasure, a bureaucratic declaration that she was no longer worth looking for while she was being chained to a pole in a basement just 3 miles from the precinct. Amanda Berry's case, beginning in April 2003, initially felt like it would be the breakthrough the city needed, as the media coverage was relentless and the public outcry was a deafening roar. The investigation was flooded with thousands of leads, but each one proved to be a psychological mirage. Detectives spent hundreds of man-hours chasing ghosts, sightings in different states, tips from self-proclaimed psychics who claimed she was buried in various vacant lots, and false leads that pointed toward her own family members. This created a chaotic, high-decibel environment where the true signal was lost in the noise. The investigation hit a wall every time a tip led to a dead end, and with each passing year, the intensity of the search began to wane. The show, Don't Tell, of this phase was the physical deterioration of her mother, Lawana Miller, who became a permanent fixture at the police station, her face growing gaunter and her eyes more hollow as she realized the investigation was moving into cold storage. The search for a green van or an older man seen near the Burger King turned up dozens of suspects, none of whom were Ariel Castro, because the police were looking for a stranger in the shadows rather than a neighbor in a yellow school bus. Gina De Jesus's disappearance in 2004 added a new layer of terror, but also a new set of NGO cut that are among the most haunting in criminal history. Because Gina was a child of 14 and had been seen walking home from school, the police couldn't dismiss her as a runaway, but they were paralyzed by the absolute lack of forensic evidence. The investigation into Gina's case was defined by a chilling irony that the detectives wouldn't realize for 9 years. Ariel Castro was not a suspect. He was a participant in the search. He stood on the sidewalks during the vigils, his hand holding a candle, his voice joining the prayers for the girl's safe return. He even shared a meal with Gina's family, offering words of comfort that were actually calculated psychological weapons. The investigation was blindfolded by Castro's proximity. They were looking for a monster that lived in a cave, while the monster was standing right next to them, playing bass guitar in a local band and driving their children to school every morning. The most devastating dead ends of the entire decade were the multiple times the police were actually called to 2207 Seymour Avenue and failed to cross the threshold. In 2004, while all three girls were trapped inside, a neighbor named Elsie Centrone called the police to report seeing three naked women crawling on leashes in Castro's backyard. It was a report of absolute, visceral horror that should have triggered a massive tactical response. Instead, the show, Don't Tell, of the systemic failure was the sight of a single police cruiser pulling up to the curb, the officers looking at the high, overgrown fence, and then leaving because no one answered the front door. They didn't hear the scratching against the plywood or the muffled screams from the upper floor because the neighborhood was too noisy, too chaotic, and they were too eager to move on to the next call. Another neighbor, Israel Lugo, reported hearing pounding on the doors and seeing the windows boarded up from the inside. But again, the investigation hit the wall of private property rights and officer apathy. The police knocked, the house remained silent, and the officers walked away, their boots clicking on the pavement with a finality that signaled another year of darkness for the women inside. Even Castro's own workplace provided a missed opportunity that is difficult to process. In 2004, he was investigated for a serious safety violation after leaving a child on a school bus and driving home to Seymour Avenue. The police actually went to his house to interview him about the incident. They stood on his porch, only feet away from where Michelle, Amanda, and Gina were being held, but because Castro didn't answer the door, they simply filed a report and left. This was the ultimate NGO cut, a moment where the law had the predator's name and was standing at his front door, yet the investigation was too tethered to procedural complacency to push through. The show, Don't Tell, of the investigation's stagnation was the fading of the missing posters across the West Side. The bright yellows and vibrant reds of the missing flyers turned a pale, sickly gray under the Ohio sun, their edges curling and their images of the girls becoming unrecognizable blurs. The world was moving on. The detectives who had originally handled the cases retired or were reassigned, and the files were moved to the cold case unit, where they became nothing more than numbers in a computer system. The investigation had been defeated by time, by the silence of the house, and by the predator's ability to mimic the rhythms of a normal life. Castro continued to drive his bus, continued to play his music, and continued to offer a wave to his neighbors, a man protected by the very urban decay that he utilized as a fortress. The investigation into the Seymour Avenue kidnappings is a study in the invisibility of the marginalized. It shows how a city can lose its daughters not because the predator is a mastermind, but because the system is designed to look away from the places where it is most needed. The show, Don't Tell, of the entire decade is the empty chair at the De Jesus dinner table, the bedroom of Amanda Berry that remained frozen in 2003, and the total silence surrounding the name of Michelle Knight. The investigation didn't fail because of a lack of effort in the beginning, but because it lacked the imagination to believe that such a nightmare could exist in the middle of a crowded block. The NGO cut were built out of assumptions: the assumption that a woman with a custody battle is a runaway, the assumption that a school bus driver is safe, and the assumption that if you knock and no one answers, there is nothing to find. As the years stretched toward 2013, the investigation was a ghost of its former self, a series of dormant files waiting for a miracle that no one in the precinct truly expected to happen. The silence of Seymour Avenue was a victory for the predator and a devastating indictment of the law, a 10-year void where the truth was only a few feet away, hidden behind a layer of plywood and the cold, unyielding indifference of a city that had stopped looking. This period was the long, dark night of the Cleveland missing girls saga, a time when the investigation was a labyrinth of closed doors and forgotten names, leaving three women to fight their own battle in a house that the world had decided was just another piece of the neighborhood's fading scenery. The psychological weight of this failure would eventually come home to roost in 2013, but for 11 long years, the investigation was nothing more than a collection of dead ends and missed signals, a tragic record of how easy it is for the light to be swallowed by the shadows of a silent street. The breakthrough that finally shattered the 11-year silence of Seymour Avenue did not arrive as a result of a sophisticated police raid or a long-gestating undercover operation, but rather through a single, catastrophic lapse in the predator's ironclad routine and the fierce, unyielding will of a woman who refused to die in the dark. For 3,678 days, Ariel Castro had operated with the clinical precision of a prison warden, managing a labyrinth of locks, alarms, and psychological terror that turned his modest frame house into an inescapable fortress. But on the afternoon of May 6, 2013, the air in Cleveland was thick with the scent of spring, a humid, heavy warmth that seemed to carry the promise of change. Castro, perhaps lulled into a dangerous state of complacency by over a decade of successful concealment, walked out of his front door to pick up a meal, leaving behind the one thing that had guaranteed his godhood, a fully engaged lock. In his haste, he had failed to secure the heavy, interior wooden door, leaving only the outer aluminum storm door between his captives and the world they had lost. This was the tiny, microscopic fracture in the armor that Amanda Berry's prayers had been searching for, a sliver of atmospheric hope that was about to ignite into a sunburst of freedom. Inside the house, the atmosphere was a pressurized vacuum of recycled breath and stagnant shadows. Amanda Berry stood in the dim light of the living room, her eyes fixed on the front door with a gaze that was both terrified and predatory. She had noticed the subtle change in the light filtering through the gaps in the plywood, a flicker of real, unfiltered sunshine that shouldn't have been there. She approached the door, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, the sound of her own blood rushing in her ears nearly drowning out the muffled noise of the neighborhood outside. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the cold wood of the interior door. When she pushed, and it swung open, she was met not with the sight of her captor, but with the bright, blinding glare of the afternoon hitting the frosted glass of the outer storm door. The interior deadbolt was disengaged. For the first time in 10 years, the only thing separating her from the sidewalk was a flimsy piece of aluminum and a simple latch. The internal conflict within Amanda at that moment was a visceral war between a decade of conditioned terror and a primal, maternal instinct to save her daughter, Jocelyn. She knew that if Castro returned and found the door open, the punishment would be absolute, a violence that might finally end their lives. But as she looked at the child standing in the shadows behind her, a little girl who had never known the feel of grass under her feet or the scent of a fresh breeze, the terror was eclipsed by a fierce, white-hot resolve. Amanda didn't just push the door. She began to scream. It wasn't a calculated call for help, but a raw, guttural eruption of the human spirit that tore through the stagnant air of the house and out onto the quiet street. She threw her weight against the bottom of the storm door, her hands clawing at the gap between the metal and the frame, her voice a jagged, high-pitched wail that cut through the sounds of the Tremont neighborhood like a siren. Across the street, Charles Ramsey was sitting in his living room, his focus on a half-eaten McDonald's burger and the mundane rhythm of a Monday afternoon. He heard the sound, a frantic, rattling noise accompanied by a woman's voice that carried an intensity he had never heard before. At first, his mind tried to categorize it as a domestic dispute, a common enough occurrence on a block where the houses were huddled together and the pressures of life were always visible. But as the screaming continued, reaching a crescendo of absolute desperation, Ramsey stood up and walked toward the porch. He looked across the narrow strip of asphalt and saw a woman he didn't recognize, her face a pale blur behind the screen of Castro's front door. He saw her hand reaching through a small hole at the bottom of the door, her fingers grasping at the air as she begged for someone to help her. The show, don't tell, of the moment was in the way Ramsey's own body reacted, the dropping of his food, the sudden sprint across the street, and the realization that the slightly odd man next door was harboring something beyond his wildest imagination. When Ramsey reached the porch of 2207, he found a woman in a state of high-velocity panic. She told him her name was Amanda Berry, a name that acted like a physical shock to his system. In Cleveland, Amanda Berry was a ghost, a face on a faded poster, a tragedy that had become part of the city's folklore. To hear that name spoken by a living, breathing woman on that specific porch was a moment of profound, reality-shattering cognitive dissonance. Ramsey didn't hesitate. He realized the door was locked from the inside in a way that wouldn't allow her to simply turn a handle. He and another neighbor, Angel Cordero, began to kick at the bottom panel of the aluminum door. The sound of the metal buckling and splintering was the sound of a decade of darkness being dismantled. With a final, violent crash, the bottom of the door gave way, creating a jagged aperture. Amanda emerged from the house like a survivor of a shipwreck, her clothes worn and dirty, her hair a tangled mess, but her eyes held a light that was blinding. She crawled through the hole, and then she reached back into the darkness to pull out her daughter, bringing the child into the light of the sun for the very first time. The scene on the sidewalk was a chaotic, beautiful tableau of human resilience. Amanda was sobbing, her body shaking so violently that she could barely stand, but she didn't stop moving. She ran to the house across the street, desperate for a telephone, her feet hitting the pavement with a frantic, rhythmic slap. When the 911 dispatcher answered, the breakthrough moved from the physical world into the official record. The voice that came across the line was both breathless and remarkably clear, a woman reclaiming her identity in real time. She identified herself with a fierce, repetitive urgency. "I'm Amanda Berry. I've been kidnapped, and I've been missing for 10 years, and I'm here, I'm free now." The dispatcher's initial skepticism, a byproduct of a decade of false leads and missing person ghosts, quickly dissolved into a stunned, professional focus. The breakthrough was no longer a neighborhood event, it was a citywide emergency. As Amanda spoke to the operator, she provided the final, devastating piece of the breakthrough. She wasn't alone. She told the police that there were other women inside the house, Gina DeJesus and Michelle Knight. These were names that were just as legendary, just as painful, in the history of Cleveland's tragedies. The realization that Ariel Castro's house was a multi-victim tomb sent a shockwave through the precinct. Within minutes, the quiet of Seymour Avenue was shattered by the rising, discordant wail of sirens. Police cruisers screeched to a halt at the curb, their tires smoking against the asphalt, their lights casting a strobe-like, blue and red panic against the jaundiced sighting of number 2207. The breakthrough had reached its tipping point. The House of Horrors was being surrounded by the very world that had failed to see it for 11 years. The officers who breached the house moved with a grim, tactical precision, but they were unprepared for the sensory nightmare that awaited them. They stepped through the broken door and into a labyrinth of architectural betrayal. The air inside didn't just smell bad, it felt heavy, a stagnant miasma of long-term confinement and unwashed desperation. Their flashlights cut through the gloom, reflecting off the layers of plywood and the industrial-grade chains that were bolted to the floorboards. As they climbed the stairs, the sound of their own boots seemed to echo in a house that had been designed to absorb screams. They found Gina DeJesus in a darkened room, her eyes wide and reflecting the light as if she were seeing a miracle or a nightmare. She was hesitant, her body tensed for a violence that didn't come, until the officers spoke her name with a gentleness that finally broke the spell of her captivity. In another room, hidden behind a series of reinforced doors and makeshift walls, they found Michelle Knight. If Amanda was the voice of the breakthrough and Gina was its soul, Michelle was its most profound tragedy. She was the first taken, the one the system had erased in 2002. When the officers found her, she was in a state of profound physical and psychological exhaustion. She threw herself into the arms of the first officer she saw, her grip so tight it felt as if she were trying to merge her body with the world she had finally found again. The show, don't tell, of the rescue was in the way the officers carried these women out of the house, shielding their eyes from the sun with blankets, their movements tender and urgent. The breakthrough was complete. 3 women who had been frozen in time were finally, officially, returned to the land of the living. The psychological weight of the breakthrough was felt most acutely by the neighbors who stood on their porches and watched the rescue unfold. They saw the ghosts of their neighborhood materialize on the sidewalk, and the realization of their own oblivious proximity to the horror was a visceral, sickening shock. They remembered the times they had seen Ariel Castro on his porch, the times they had seen him driving his school bus, and the times they had heard the music blaring from his windows. They realized that the sausage factory smell of the neighborhood, the urban decay, the neglect, had been the perfect camouflage for a monster. The breakthrough was a moment of collective reckoning for Seymour Avenue, a shattering of the illusion that we ever truly know the people who live behind the walls next to ours. The forensic processing of the house that followed was the final, technical stage of the breakthrough. Investigators uncovered the chains, the padlocks, and the diaries of despair that documented the women's decade of endurance. They found the evidence of Michelle's multiple miscarriages, a record of the absolute brutality she had survived. They found the marks on the walls where the girls had counted the days, a microscopic, rhythmic history of their lost years. Every piece of evidence was a show, don't tell, of the sheer duration and intensity of their struggle. The breakthrough had pulled back the veil on a system of control that was both medieval in its cruelty and modern in its clinical organization. Castro had turned a house into a machine of suffering, and the investigation was now dismantling that machine piece by piece. The breakthrough also forced a massive, public confrontation with the failures of the Cleveland Police Department and the systemic apathy that had allowed these girls to remain missing for so long. The files that had been gathering dust in the cold case units were now the subject of international scrutiny. The breakthrough proved that the runaway labels and the low-priority categorizations were not just mistakes, they were death sentences for the hope of the families. The sight of Felix de Jesus embracing his daughter Gina on the sidewalk was a visual indictment of every detective who had ever told him to stop looking. This was the breakthrough of accountability, a moment where the city had to face its own prejudices and its own neglect in the bright, harsh light of a Monday afternoon. The emotional core of the breakthrough remains the image of Amanda Berry's hand reaching through that hole in the door. It was a moment of absolute, singular courage that redefined the narrative of the entire case. She didn't wait for a hero. She became one. She recognized the mistake. She fought the terror, and she made the choice to scream until the world finally listened. This was the engine of the breakthrough, not a police procedure, but a mother's fierce, protective love for her daughter and her sisters in the dark. The breakthrough was the sound of wood splintering, the feel of fresh air on the skin, and the first, frantic words of a 911 call that changed the world forever. As the women were taken to the hospital and the house at 2207 Seymour Avenue was officially cordoned off as a crime scene, the atmosphere of the neighborhood shifted from panic to a somber, reflective silence. The sun began to set, casting long, skeletal shadows over the empty lot and the gathering crowds. The breakthrough had left the street a different place. The secrets were out, the monster was being hunted, and the ghosts were no longer ghosts. The breakthrough was the end of the 11-year night, but it was also the beginning of a long, painful morning of healing and justice. The air was still thick with the scent of spring, but now it also carried the weight of the truth, a truth that had been hidden in plain sight, waiting for a woman to find the crack in the door. The sensory memories of that afternoon, the taste of the dust in the air, the sound of the kicking foot, the sight of the blankets being draped over the survivors, are the permanent markers of the breakthrough. It was a day when the impossible became real, and when 3 women taught a city and a world the true meaning of the word, hope. The breakthrough at Seymour Avenue was a study in the power of a single moment to dismantle a decade of depravity. It was the moment the chains were broken, the locks were opened, and the invisibles were finally seen. As the sirens continued to wail into the evening, they no longer sounded like a warning. They sounded like an anthem for those who had survived the heart of darkness and found their way back to the light. The psychological breakthrough for the investigators was realizing that Ariel Castro's power was entirely dependent on the silence and the apathy of the world around him. He wasn't a mastermind. He was a man who exploited a vacuum of attention. The breakthrough in the case was the realization that the most effective cage is one built out of familiarity and neglect. Every lock they found, every board they removed, was a piece of that realization. The breakthrough was the moment the city realized that it had to start looking at the missing not as files, but as neighbors. It was a breakthrough of empathy, a sudden, blinding awareness of the people we pass every day without ever truly seeing. In the end, the breakthrough of Seymour Avenue is a story of three voices finding each other in the dark and then finding the strength to speak to the world. It is the story of Amanda's scream, Gina's steady gaze, and Michelle's unyielding grip. It is a narrative of the light finally finding its way through a crack in the plywood, proving that no matter how deep the abyss, the human spirit can always find a way to reach for the sun. The breakthrough was the end of the House of Horrors, but the beginning of a legend of survival that would haunt and inspire the world for generations to come. The street was quiet now, the crowds were gone, but the echo of that first scream still hung in the air, a rhythmic, haunting reminder that the darkness is never absolute and that the breakthrough is always just a heartbeat away.